Good morning, everybody. This is Monica Hernandez with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. I am going to introduce our committee chair, Dr. David Sander, also Mayor of Rancho Cordova, former vice chair of the former chair of SACOG, and chair of the Commercial Corridor Task Force to kick off our meeting. Chair Sander.
Good morning. Am I loud and clear? Good. Well, welcome to the second meeting of the Commercial Corridor Task Force. I'm David Sander. I'm chair of this committee, SACOG board member, and mayor of Rancho Cordova this year. So let's start with a roll call. Lynette, do you want to call the roll of our membership? And Lynette?
There is a bit of a delay coming from Lynette's home. This is Monica again, so we will get the roll call started in just one moment.
Yes.
You might need to do it, Monica, if there's a big delay.
Okay, we can definitely make that happen. Just
you won't be able to hear the responses in time.
Okay, got it. We are going to unmute all of the participants. We ask that you do keep yourself muted until you are called to reduce any background noise.
Well, I do have a nice list of people who are in attendance, just looking at the screen, a couple of mystery phone numbers, but other than that, we have an idea of who's here.
Yes, we do. Lynette, are you ready for a roll or shall I call it? All right, that looks like I will be calling roll this morning.
Sorry about that, Monica. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you. Thanks, Lynette.
Okay, sorry about that. I had a couple of technical difficulties. So just before I call roll, I just wanted to make a couple of housekeeping instructions. And I just wanted to let our task force members know that the meeting is being streamed on YouTube and that members of our task force who are participating by telephone, you can press *9 to make a comment. And if you are participating through Zoom on your device, you can just raise your hand. And we have staff who will be monitoring that to make sure that we see your raised hands. And then again, if you're not speaking, if you can mute your device. All right, I'll go ahead and take roll. Dean Ellis. Okay, Michael Stretch is absent. Stephen Dawes. Absent. Julie Young.
Here.
Sandra Drown. Okay, absent. Jose Boripo Mimba.
Here.
Thank you. Isabel Domeco. Absent. Amy Lappin.
Here.
Louise Bedsworth.
Here.
Pat Hewitt. Absent. And Jen Matalich is absent. Moving on to our SACOG board members who are task force members. Chair Sander.
Here.
Michael Saragosa.
Here.
Robert Jankovitz.
Here.
John Allard.
Here.
Jill Gallardo.
Here.
Sean Harris.
I'm here. Good morning.
Thank you. Mike Kozlowski. Absent. Ricky Samayoa. Absent. Jay Chenier.
Here.
Jeff Slowey,
Here.
and Michael Dewar.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes our roll call.
All right, I think I see Deanna Ellis represented here. I'm not sure she sounded off for the roll call, but I do see her name on a box.
Danny Brown with the,
There she
I'm
is.
sorry.
All right, very
Dina
good.
Ellis with Cressley. I am here. Good morning.
Good morning, excellent. All right, so
And you have
before,
Penny Brown with the Yuba City Downtown Business Association.
very good. Anyone else got missed?
And we have Director Sam Iowa connecting now.
Hi, I'm here, sorry.
Okay, before I jump to the agenda, I wanted to thank all of you for making the time for this meeting, particularly under these circumstances. You know, this is a required thing for elected officials, but this is not really expected or required of everyone else who's on this call. So we really appreciate your participation, especially as we're under this COVID-19 pandemic crisis that we're in. So it's very moving to see as much participation here as we have outside of the elected officials, because you guys are just doing your duty, right? But anyway, I thought it'd be helpful to summarize our purpose and talk about where we are today and where we're headed. So you've all seen the agenda, I assume, for today. Oh, here's some of the nice complications of these meetings. We'll see how often that happens during the meeting. I wanted to summarize sort of where we've been, where we're going. I assume you've all seen the agenda for today. And you know, this group is pretty unique because we are a voluntary group. We're unpaid experts in housing, finance, development, and a bunch of SACOG board members. We're rural, suburban, urban, all around Sacramento. And so our work complements each other, but we also do direct work, hopefully, in removing barriers to commercial corridor revitalization. This commission originated in 2019 when I was chair of the SACOG board. And so the task force is young and fresh and hopefully bold and not burdened by any history or unnecessary, you know, regulations or responsibilities at this point. So hopefully we can continue to have free and open discussions as a result of that. Now, it was clear from the first meeting that all of us wanted outcomes. We wanted to, and we wanted to continue to ask ourselves the key question. Does everyone remember the key question? How do we catalyze investment in commercial corridors? What will it take and by who? What will it take and by who to catalyze investments in commercial corridors? So this task force is the place where we can hear from the private sector, consider what local governments are doing, what we can do, what we wish we could do, things maybe we could make happen together to lessen the burden on developers, banks, advocates, neighbors, local government, to try to get this kind of challenging development going more in our region. So we also recognized in our first meeting where we're going to solve all the challenges, but we had a unique opportunity here for the private sector to talk to us. And I think from my personal perspective, that was the most valuable thing I heard from our last meeting, was that direct input from the private sector about the barriers they face and some opportunities they see in working on these commercial corridors together. So today we're going to start with the discussion about the new reality we're facing, sort of in the midst of COVID. And we're also going to listen a lot. And I specifically want staff to have the opportunity to hear from everyone here, public and private, and factor in what they learn to future meeting content and what we are trying to achieve as a task force. So please, I know the technology can be limiting. It can also perhaps be liberating. I hope that's the case here. Please take advantage of the opportunities here to speak up. We want to hear from everybody. And then we're going to follow up today with that same barriers exercise, at least follow up to the barriers exercise that we did last time that I think was pretty fruitful. We're going to hear some specific solutions and some of the identified barriers from SACOG staff about those that exercise we did last time. And then finally, we're going to hear a presentation today from SACOG staff on a funding proposal for housing funds that is becoming available in the SACOG region. So does anybody have any questions at this point or any housekeeping that we need to take care of? Otherwise, we're going to move into our first discussion.
Chair Sanders, this is John Allard from Roseville.
John.
I just wanted to give you a heads up. I'm in line to give testimony to the Placer County Board of Supervisors meeting about the COVID-19 issue. And so I may disappear. You may not see my face, which actually may be a good thing for a while because I'm going to give comments. So I just wanted to give you a heads up and I apologize for that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Anything else? All right, we are going to move on to our agenda, and this is item number 2, discussion. What are task force members seeing in terms of projects moving forward and project delays, and what can local jurisdictions do? So let me ask sort of the opening question. Obviously, a lot of people have moved to remote work. Things are being done online. Meetings like this one are happening online. What is the biggest adjustment you have had to make in order to keep your work going forward? Just quick answers if anybody has them.
This is Dina Ellis with Cressley Homes. I would say to a certain extent, we continue to prosecute entitlements. One of the barriers has been the ability to be able to meet with staff and with electeds on either design decisions or landscaping and doing those type of things. The technology is starting to be embraced more and more throughout a number of different cities. But in the beginning, it's a tall order, for cities and for builders to go from everything that's in person, it's an in-person type of business to going to technology, which can be impersonal. I do think that different development groups in different cities are doing a better and a worse job of it. I also think it's just the real reality. I think those that are going to do well in the future are going to have to learn how to adapt and to recognize. I don't think Zoom calls and remote meetings are going away anytime soon. So I think all of us are going to have to get comfortable in that environment.
I think you're exactly right about that. So can we get the list of the good and the bad?
List of the
you said some agencies are doing really well, others not so much. That was a joke. We don't need to.
Oh, sorry. I was like, how do I delicately say that?
Time to mute, right? All right. Anybody else? How are you adapting to this environment?
Hi, this is Louise Bedsworth with the California Strategic Growth Council. And we have obviously funding out to a lot of projects, housing projects, local government projects. And so we've been working very hard. I'm eager to hear the answers here, but to give as much leeway and room as we're able to help our grantees meet their timelines and everything under the current circumstances, knowing that we currently don't understand the full impacts on timelines, but working through that and just trying to understand how the state can be sure to be supporting local governments to be able to complete projects and and adjust as we're able within our constraints currently. And then if we need to revisit expenditure deadlines and things like that, just to ensure that projects that are in the pipeline aren't completely thrown off by this disruption.
Anyone else?
This is Jose Bodipo Memba, representing the Urban Land Institute. I would say that the disruption has definitely changed our delivery of material. I'm trying to find ways to make sure the content that we provide is applicable to today's current situation, but not to completely solely focus on COVID, but look at, again, what are some of the ongoing needs for our region. The Zoom meetings for us have gone pretty well. Actually, have allowed us to tap into our international network. But again, as mentioned earlier, not everyone has the same access to technology, same comfort level. So just trying to find a way to make sure that we're providing value to the region is what we're trying to figure out. We're hoping we're doing a good job, but again, it's a difficult space because this is, as Deanna said before, very face-to-face, person-to-person business. So we're trying our best to adjust.
Very good. Who's next? Particular challenges in this COVID environment. Anybody?
Chair Sanders, this is Sean Harris from the city. I just want to echo what some folks have already alluded to, and that is the initiation or the necessity of interjecting technology into our daily life now. I agree that Zoom meetings and whatnot are definitely not going away anytime soon, but it was a challenge. I'm not a tech guy at all, but it was a challenge. But I also find that on the positive side, it can, once we adapt, make us much more efficient. Look at the drive time, just for myself, and I know Mayor Samayoa would have had to make to Sacramento. That saves us 2.5 hours that we could be doing other things. And I'm definitely not wearing a tie right now either. So, there's things that we can do to use that time to make us more efficient. Challenges with the COVID in general, I think, comes from the difference of opinions. There are certain things, along the continuum, certain things are definitely we don't want to do. On the other side, certain things we definitely want to do. But in the middle lies discretion. And when we have discretion, where people have choices in the opinions, some folks just want to open up, for example, open up Yuba City right away, no matter what. And you got to understand that this virus is biological. It doesn't care about your politics. I've heard arguments about the First Amendment and constitutional rights and this and that, but this is biology, and we have to make sure we manage it smartly, incrementally, and don't open up too much, at least in my opinion. So we're in the discretion lies is where the conversations, and that's the test of some real relationships that have hopefully been building for a while, but we'll see how it fleshes out. But that's kind of one of my primary experiences so far.
All right. Anybody else?
Hey, David, it's Michael Saragosa, City of Placerville.
How you doing?
Good. Just from my perspective, I think, when COVID first happened, everybody made the switch to try to, put policies and practices in place, and that slowed us down a little bit in terms of just our normal workflow. But, we've adjusted, gotten used to remote working, and we have a couple of affordable housing projects that are still moving along quite nicely. I think we've done a really good job there. Our staff's done a great job of doing that. But I think it's going to be the long term, how we adapt to this long term and what the challenges are going to be. I know we've seen a little bit of dip of what used to be people just coming to the counter for regular applications or variances, different things, and that's slowed down a bit. And I don't know if that's just because people are uncomfortable working in an online environment, or if it's just people are pulling back on some of the work that they would have normally done. So it's going to be a challenge for us to work with our developer partners and just people in the community to see how we continue to do our normal daily work, and then how that will ultimately play out over the next few months. I think that's going to be a challenge for us. We've adapted, but I still think we've seen a slowdown. The good thing is our capital improvement projects are still moving. It hasn't really done too much there. All of our crews are still out, but I do see a challenge. Already we've seen a slight dip in applications coming in from the public.
All right. Anybody else?
Chair,
Yes,
it's
go ahead.
Jill Galdo. From what biggest concern I have is the lack of ability to plan. We're trying to meet and come with creative ideas and how do we move forward? And there's that always, well, if things are open in June, if things are open in July. So the challenge I'm really seeing is being able to move ahead and make plans when we're just not certain if we're able to do events or have these meetings later on. And then the lack of connection. I think we're also concerned about approving large projects when we're not getting the public feedback that we would normally get at an open public meeting. Definitely the numbers of people that call in or mail something in are much lower than what we see at our regular meetings. So there is that concern. We need to be moving forward and we need to get our projects done. But then you also hear from people, well, maybe we should hold off on approving this until there's more people aware or available to be there.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
This is Saragossa again. I just want to echo that as well. I serve as mayor this year, and I've already put off a couple of items because of that exact reason, where I just don't feel we're getting the public participation that's necessary for those larger discussions.
Chair Sander, I believe we have Director Samayoa who wanted to make comments as well.
Thank you, Monica. Just talking to our community development director, he actually says that he's staying fairly busy with calls. Specifically, seems like given the stock market taking a hit, there seems to be people willing to diversify their portfolio and looking for opportunities in the real estate area. I don't know how that's going to actually, how's that going to end up, but there seems to be some appetite out there for new investments or as folks want to diversify their portfolio and look for opportunities to invest. So from our end here in Marysville, it seems to me that there is some appetite out there to invest. So how that translates at the end of this whole thing, we will see. But our folks are staying busy taking calls and meeting with folks.
Okay, good. Monica, thank you for highlighting that. I can't see a hand up unless someone visually waves at me here. So if you can just call those out when that happens, that'd be great. Let's see. Anybody else want to chime in on this?
David, this is Julie Young. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good morning. From a developer perspective, I could say the biggest thing that I'm having to interject is just a giant pause into everything that we're doing and be realistic about the fact that this is universal, it's not specific. The people that I see that are willing to invest are primarily looking for discounts and deals in this market because of the uncertainty. I wouldn't say it's a business as usual environment. I have put one of my housing projects on hold, primarily just because of uncertainty with equity and lending. Although I do see a real big willingness for people to try to think outside the box and problem solve. The jurisdictions I'm working with, Sacramento in particular, has been really good to deal with. From the planning side in particular, they've been adaptable. I have a project that I'm working on where it was strictly a retail project, and we were able to go back into planning and say, hey, if we're able to incorporate 22 small studio housing units into this project in lieu of some of the retail space, will you consider this as a mixed use adaptable project instead of a retail project? Of the development community that I've talked to, anybody with retail tenants, they're receiving about 10% of the normal rent that they receive. Office tenants have kind of picked up on this no eviction message that the city of Sacramento sent out, and that's kind of had a negative ripple effect from the perspective that people that are still having their doors open are kind of using that as an excuse not to pay rent. So I think the reality of the task force is we need to be aware that retail will be forever impacted by what's going on with COVID. And we will really need to be adaptable, particularly for retail uses. I think that we will see a lot of people going out of business. In the case of my projects, I really only have one retail user that's waffling right now. They weren't strong to begin with. I think there are a lot of people out there that were probably on a track to fail, not because I would wish that on anyone, but some people just are better with adapting than others. And I think we're going to see a lot of those closures. And as a result, we're going to have to be really creative about the way we backfill all of retail, not just along commercial corridors. So I think the time is really ripe from a commercial corridor task force perspective to really look at what in this environment an ideal makeup really looks like on commercial corridors, and to kind of, as jurisdictions, define that, because I think there's more commonality there than, we recognize. It's not 20 or 28 different zones. It's a bunch of zones that all really kind of need the same thing, and that those common denominators are really important right now. Because there's going to be a huge change in the way retail is handled going forward. And I think we just need to be aware that the ratios of what you'd ideally like to see are probably not going to bounce back anytime in the next year or two.
I think
This
that
is
is
Dina Ellis. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, David.
go right ahead, Dina.
I was just going to say, 100 years ago, I used to build grocery stores all across the nation prior to going to residential development. And I could not agree more with Julia's previous statements. I think COVID is only an accelerant. It's only gas on what was previously happening in retail. It is forever changed. And so one of the biggest things I see is many of the cities still cling to the idea that sales tax and the sales tax basis of how they're running their budgets within their cities is really predicated on a broken model. That model, it was broken 2 years ago. It's forever broken now. It's not coming back. And so I think we're going to have to look at different ways that we tax ourselves within our cities. I think more live-work type of things, in the most dense portions of any city, whether it's Placerville, whether it's Marysville, whether it's Roseville, whether it's the city of Sacramento. Creating more of these live-work where you can have a tax accountant on the bottom floor or a hair salon and your unit is above it. Those type of things, I think, will be really vital to be able to get any drumbeat of a sales tax or a tax on a go-forward basis. Because I think we'll see nothing but a future acceleration of online retail. And I emphatically agree with that statement. It is not going to come back in the same way. So I think every city is going to have to take a deep dive into how they view their projects, or not just their projects, but their budgets, because I think there's an over-reliance in some cities on retail tax. So.
Wow, those are great, great comments and great observations from the two of you. I really appreciate that. So this change of mix on a commercial corridor, I think that is a particularly rich discussion going forward, because I think you're right. I think a lot of local planning is predicated on that notion of what's going to generate sales tax. And we knew that was changing before, but as the virologist sitting here, I sort of apologize. This is Dr. David Sander up there. That was from a previous meeting where I was being a different kind of professional, I guess. This is not going away anytime soon. There is no magic bullet until a vaccine arrives. If a vaccine arrives, depending on what kind of vaccine arrives. So we're gonna have to get used to sort of a new normal here as we work through this. And so it's not months, it's years probably to get to that point. And you're exactly right that, the Amazon effect, whatever you want to call it, that effect on retail is really accelerating now. It'd be interesting to know exactly how much. I don't have any numbers at hand with sales tax returns yet for my city, but I can tell you that in the travel and tourism business, they're off about 90% from where they were. We've got a huge share of that in Rancho Cordova. So hopefully our local retailers aren't hit that hard. I know some places like Walmart and Costco are actually up, I think. Whereas a lot of the smaller mom and pop stores, I think, are getting devastated by this.
This is Sandy from the Yuba City Downtown Association, and I can say that we have 120 members. We have our retail is down. Some of them are down 0%. Most of the restaurants are down 75%. And so it's been a real dramatic hit for us. Our downtown is a ghost town right now. But I know from the businesses, it's going to be definitely a struggle, especially with the loans. I know our business was going to purchase another business on Plymouth Street, and we had to use the COVID-19 to get back our deposit because we just don't know where our business is going to be in another 4 weeks.
But imagine if, It does take some imagination, but imagine one of the things I think we're going to all have to do as a society on a go-forward basis is being more resilient, right? I mean, we're going to have to look at duplication of items, but imagine how, and I adore what Yuba City has done with Plymouth Street. I think it's exemplary of leadership and things that the city did. But imagine if there were more direct housing linked in downtown on Plymouth Street. How much more resilient the retail would be because of that. You could run across the street and you could pick up a bag from a bagel shop. You could do those kind of things. Would it bring it back from the 75%, from the outside of the core of Plymouth Street? Probably not. But I think things are going to become hyper-local. One of the things that was the opposite of the Amazon effect was that restaurants and anything that was experience related was something that Amazon really couldn't, they couldn't break that bubble. And now I think restaurants, you're going to have less seating in restaurants, so occupancy is going to be different. Do I think restaurants will come back? I do. I don't think they'll look the same way. And I think those restaurateurs that can adapt as quick as possible, that they are growing their online presence and growing their takeout side, I think will be more resilient, coming out of this.
Can I confirm that that was Dina speaking?
Yes, it was Dina speaking. Sorry about that.
Dina.
Thank you, Dina. And then Chair
Monica,
Jose Bodipa Memba, who would like to make some comments, Mr. Chair.
yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Chair. Related to what Deanna was saying, what Julie was saying, we've had the opportunity through ULI to talk to folks in ULI, mainland China and South Korea. And again, since they are a little bit further ahead in this whole conversation, some of the impacts that they've seen, on the negative side, they've seen a tremendous increase in vehicle traffic because of the concerns of using public transportation. And that was something that they did not anticipate as a part of the new normal, something that could impact us here. And the whole concept of placemaking has definitely shifted in China in terms of gathering spaces and how folks want to not just handle their retail experience, but handle their placemaking experience. So again, as folks have mentioned, we don't necessarily want to compare one-to-one exactly how things are happening in Asia and happening here. But their hotel use has been significantly down. They're actually reducing the number of restaurant seating, as was mentioned before, and redesigning the restaurant spaces to accommodate the smaller uses, trying to find alternate uses for other parts of the space in the building. So again, there's lots of information that's out there, but like you said, the new normal may be localized depending on how quickly we can adjust to the takeout experience, to the walking experience, what have you. But there's definitely been some good information from China and from Korea that we can take into account as to what we might see here.
Very good comments. Anybody else want to chime in on changes?
Really, just have a question. What can local governments do to kind of provide, to enhance the or help the changes or get these businesses to a point where they can redesign their businesses? Or, I mean, I guess, how do we support the local corridors as a local government?
Anybody have a comment on that question?
David, this is Julie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
To just piggyback on the discussion that the group is having, I would completely agree with the statement that the small local operator who's able to adapt and to increase their website presence, increase their delivery presence, and increase basically multi-tiers of ability to get product out the door, that there is this really good opportunity out of all of this and a lot more loyalty to the small local business operator. And I have a lot of hope and frankly, a lot of investment that will bear out and that we will be loyal to those operators and that we will help them adapt to kind of this new normal. I do agree that people who've gotten really used to having their groceries delivered and these other alternatives, they may not stop that for a while. So, warehousing is going to probably still remain strong as these businesses like Walmart and Amazon and Instacart ramp up and continue to do a lot of this delivery versus experiential interaction. And I also think that what this is really telling us is, again, how critical housing is to all of it. That rooftops and people spending their money locally is really the solution. And to me, the whole point of the commercial corridor is to put the mass of people together to support the businesses that surround the rooftops so that retail and office can thrive, and that you have these self-referential environments that truly support each other, regardless of COVID-19, regardless of, highs and lows in a recessionary market, that it is really the only model that kind of works. And I do agree that this is an accelerant going forward to push us toward these commercial corridors that are self-referential, where people have their needs met in these smaller, more self-contained environments where we can look out for each other. So I think the question was, how do jurisdictions help with that?
Yes.
And one of my suggestions at the last task force meeting was that we recognize that density is forever going to be imperative, that we help projects that have smaller square footages in particular, that we look at how maybe some fees are collected as opposed to on a per unit basis, that they look at it on a square footage basis, because a 350 square foot studio cannot bear $36,000 in permits and fees, or even $28,000 in permits and fees, that we really have to look at how fees are collected on a per square foot basis. I think we've got to do everything we can to encourage housing, whether it's affordable under a traditional model versus more creative, potentially attainable projects where the developer is trying to drive the project to a lower point of entry. I think those things are important. And I just basically think we need to do everything we possibly can to support housing and kind of move out of the way of that product. One of the other points I made at the last task force is simply building for rent housing is not putting any more wealth into the individual occupant's hands. It's really just helping the developer. And I'm a developer, I love that. But I think until we can get more for sale product out there, we're not really uplifting our communities. And that means we've got to focus on condo and removing some of the barriers that keep developers from building dense projects that can be owned and occupied by the occupant, and build some personal wealth.
Excellent. Yeah, I think housing being the key to commercial corridors is the big answer. And if there is a benefit from COVID, it's that it's going to accelerate that realization, that housing is the answer and local experience is the must going forward. There was already that experience thing was building with the Amazonization of retail, but I think under these circumstances, that's probably a really key message that you just spoke of there. Any other comments there on that topic? You know, my jurisdiction, Rancho Cordova, we have done some innovation here, trying to figure out how to process applications and keep things moving forward even in this environment. And so I know at one point, a lot of local jurisdictions had just simply closed their front desks, their counters. We never did that. We found ways to adapt and operate them in a safe way. And we had the advantage of being almost, I think, entirely online. We had the ability to just about be 100% online before. So there was also that option. I'm curious, other local governments, have you found a way to reopen? I don't think at this point we have any particular barriers in Rancho Cordova in place now that weren't there before. I mean, I don't think there's any artificial pressure right now that deters an applicant other than the general business environment. do other local jurisdictions, have you adapted to this, or are you playing the strategy of waiting it out?
David, in Folsom, we've continued to operate just the same as y'all have.
Yeah, I think we're the
And
two.
we had kind of randomly about a year ago put up a partition more for security purposes at one of our counters, and we just basically had everybody go there first so that we had some separation between the staff and the applicants coming in. But aside from that, we've carried on business as usual, which in some ways I think begs the question, this like sort of trust of the smaller businesses in our communities and whether or not we trust them to do what we did is kind of a tricky balancing act that we're about to have to decide right now.
Yeah.
Or in the coming weeks, because we responsibly kept our city operating and hasn't added to any kind of, difficulty for anybody. But do we trust our local barbershops, for instance, just as an example, to responsibly, manage their customer flow? I think we kind of, we need to be there soon. So.
Anybody else, either side of the counter, any comments on how you've been able to keep processing applications, or whether they've been stopped, slowed down?
So David, this is Jeff from Citrus Heights. I think the interesting thing, I mean, we did close our counters, but we're doing everything either online or via the phone. I think interestingly enough, we're doing building inspections via, FaceTime and video. I think when this is all over, we're going to do a random sampling and go back and re-inspect those. But I mean, that right there, I mean, I see that continuing forward for some of the small stuff. Why do you need to send a person out if you've, if the person comes in, paid a fee, we might have to update our disclosures, et cetera. But, for a water heater, they can certainly use their phone and show you that they've got straps on their water heater. We don't have to send somebody out to look at that. Hopefully it's the right water heater. Yeah. But, it'll be interesting because I do think things will change. As you know, things can't really change too much at the police department. We still have a counter open, which has always been, a barrier counter, so that hasn't been a problem. But we are doing a lot more follow-up on the phone rather than sending officers out on certain situations. So I think a lot of this is going to become the norm as we go forward.
All right. Anybody else on that topic? All right. I think, Monica, we should probably move on to our next agenda item, and that's that follow-up on the barriers exercise.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to do a brief walkthrough of our results. We're going to revisit where we were, and we have created, SACOG staff have created a follow-up survey. So essentially asking you all to revisit this. If you recall, I'm going to start sharing my screen here in just a moment. One second. All right. So if you recall, we went through an exercise where we asked you to think about barriers that SACOG staff had identified across a few categories: infrastructure, regulatory and process challenges, cost and funding, societal barriers, and then market barriers. And what I'm showing right now are the results of that exercise. And for those of you on the phone, we will share this as follow-up. And so I want to walk through this just to refresh everybody's memory, and then to have you set up for Dobbs' presentation, which will follow this, where he will talk about some local policy actions to overcome a few of these barriers. But as follow-up to this meeting, we want to resend this survey, ask you to complete it online so that we can then look at the post-COVID items and see what has potentially shifted or not, and how that might shape the direction of the SACOG staff work in terms of research for what are policy actions that have been in place in other areas or in some areas, so that we can bring that back to the SACOG board in their Land Use and Natural Resource Committee to revisit. So for infrastructure, the barrier identified as most significant, or by the largest number, 14 people identified this, is unknown sewer or water upgrade needs. Second was lack of complete streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, streetscaping, etc. And then for the regulatory process, the top two barriers were complex or lengthy permit approval processes. I think we heard that reiterated again this morning in our discussion, the CEQA process, and then CEQA litigation risk. And for cost and fundings, the cost of construction, the lack of comparables for appraisals, and then impact fee, or excuse me, there was a bit of a tie. So affordable housing finance and investment capital limited in transitioning markets. And we identified these commercial corridors as those one component or one illustrative area of the transitioning markets. And then impact fees was below those two items. And then on the societal or the human social barriers, lack of champions at all levels of government, NIMBYs or community engagement. And when we discussed that in our first meeting, we also heard that sometimes the very important public processes can become part of a challenge, both on the municipal side and the developer side. And then with the same number, 10 folks indicating that balance between historical roots and economic development. So how does a community maintain their identity, create places for existing residents, but still want to, bring in new investments? So it kind of leans towards that investment without displacement, which is certainly a difficult challenge. And then finally, in that market space, the biggest barrier identified was market rents not being compatible with the high construction costs. And then property or business owner disengagement. We heard a lot of examples of that in our commercial corridor task force, or excuse me, our commercial corridor focus in Civic Lab Year 2. That was the SACOG process, and we had some staff talking about that. And then public-private partnerships are too complicated or time-consuming. I know I was very brief in that, but just wanted to refresh everybody's memory in order to set up the next presentation. And again, we will send this same survey out as an online or a digital poll. We did think about how we might do that in this forum, but given our experience on some other sessions trying to do the live polling and the discussion just seemed a little bit too challenging. So again, this information is used by SACOG staff to help basically drive the research for this task force to then feed into our board discussions so that we can help turn the dial. And with that, I'm gonna pause. Mr. Chair, there may be some more questions, and I will stop sharing the screen as well.
Okay, are there any comments about what you just heard from Monica? That was sort of a summary of where we were at our last meeting. And we're gonna have a presentation to follow on to this discussion. Is there any comments on what you just saw? Okay, I don't see any coming, so I think we're ready for a presentation from Dov.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen as well here. Everybody can see that. So thank you and good morning, everyone. My name is Dov Caden, and I work on housing and land use issues here at SACOG. That was a really great tee-up discussion in the agenda item right before this, because I'm going to be talking a lot about getting that housing on the corridors and around the corridors, and some of the local solutions to the barriers that this task force has already been discussing. So going back to the barriers exercise summary from the January meeting, it's clear that we face challenges to building housing really across the board in our commercial corridors. Some of those challenges are in the direct control of local governments. And then some are less so. Cities and counties are somewhat limited in their ability to impact some of the more structural issues like construction costs, like market forces. Maybe to some extent they control infrastructure, but oftentimes don't have the funding to actually make the necessary upgrades and proactively attract that investment. However, what cities and counties do have direct control over is that green column, the regulatory and process column, which is really what I'm going to be focusing on today. And when there's so many other challenges, I think it's hard to motivate ourselves to fix any one problem, but there really is still value in pursuing the policy changes that are within our control. And illustrating that point, SACOG held a board workshop last year where folks from the UC Berkeley Turner Center came out and did a return on cost analysis of a hypothetical suburban apartment building in the Sacramento region. This was a pro forma based analysis that was based on a suburban SACOG rent and cost situation. Obviously, there's variations across that area, but this was just sort of an approximation. And one of the interesting takeaways from that presentation was that the project didn't pencil at first under existing conditions, but by layering a series of policy changes that are within local control, the project did become feasible. So we wanted to talk about some of the policy recommendations that SACOG has been working with our member agencies to implement that reduce the barriers to building the housing that we all really want to see. And that housing is going to look different depending upon the corridor. Some of the more urban contexts may be striving for something more like the right side of the screen. I'm going to mostly be focusing on the smaller scale multifamily products today because these are the products that work directly on the corridor in most of our region in the more rural and suburban areas. But even for the more urban corridors, it also works really well in the surrounding neighborhoods around the corridors to provide that proximate customer base in walking distance of the businesses on the corridor. And it can really be sort of a part of the revitalization there. So just a couple examples here, just to get a flavor of what I'm talking about. This first one is a townhome project. Each door that you see, each of the 4 doors there has 4 apartment units in it across 3 floors. So 16 units here. You can tell, really making efficient use of a pretty small lot. This is actually 72 units an acre, which is pretty dense. 0 parking spaces. You wouldn't be able to fit the 16 units here if there was any parking. And it's currently on the market for $300,000 a unit. This second one is a 6-plex. This is in a single family neighborhood, which is just over about 50 units an acre. Again, 0 parking spaces and currently on the market for a little over $300,000 a door. So both of those examples are pretty dense. They kind of fit pretty well into any sort of neighborhood, and they're relatively affordable for new construction. And the question is, what kind of policy actions does it take to actually build these types of products? So I'm going to go through some of the high-level recommendations across zoning, development review processes, and fees that local governments could use to reduce some of the barriers. So the first category is zoning, and I think it's sometimes easy to just think of zoning as what is the maximum units per acre that the zone allows. And certainly that can be a barrier. The 2 products we just showed are no skyscrapers, but both are over 50 units an acre. And that's a density that's greater than the maximum allowed in almost all of our region, including most of our commercial corridors. In fact, over 95% of the residential land in our region doesn't allow for over 30 units an acre. So the sort of the top level recommendation is to take a look at that maximum units per acre density and sort of relax it a little bit. But there's also these other aspects of zoning that can be a barrier to these products. So you can see the street view of the sixplex here while it was still under construction. And you can see how the building needs basically the whole lot to actually fit the 6 units on a parcel that small. So this has 4-foot setbacks. It uses about 85% of the lot, has 0 parking spaces. As soon as you introduce some fairly common requirements, like a 50% lot coverage maximum, like a 20-foot setback minimum on either side, or require 2 parking spaces per unit, that sixplex becomes physically impossible to build, regardless of what the density in the zone allowed. So when you apply all 3, you barely have room for a single family home. So it's all of these sort of hidden barriers within our zoning that are sometimes actually driving how many units you can actually fit on the parcel. So the second category is development review processes. And the primary policy we wanted to highlight here is to move from more of a discretionary review process, like the one on the left, towards more of a ministerial or a by right process, like the one on the right. And a by right process is one in which you set up the objective standards and the rules up front. And then if a project comes forward that plays within those rules, that's not asking for any deviations, it would be approved at the staff level, and it wouldn't need to go to some sort of yes/no vote by a decision-making body like a planning commission, city council, board of supervisors. So the surface level benefit of this type of process is that it can significantly reduce the time and the uncertainty of getting a project approved. So thinking back to that sixplex in a single family neighborhood, you don't have the risk of a couple vocal neighbors having maybe a disproportionate influence at a city council meeting on a project that may have community-wide benefits. But then there's this other benefit though, and it has to do with CEQA, which the task force did identify as one of those barriers. And CEQA only applies to projects that are approved through a discretionary process. So by approving projects at the staff level, which is a choice that a city and county can make, you're both relieving the burden of providing a CEQA document, and you're eliminating much of the litigation risk down the road. So this is a particularly important policy change right now at a time, as we were speaking about earlier, when our typical processes are maybe taking a little bit longer than usual. Lenders are maybe especially weary of delays right now. So this is a really good policy to be pursuing in the COVID times. I do want to give a shout out to City of Sacramento, who's actually working on a proposal right now to move all zoning compliant multifamily projects to being approved at the staff level, which is great to see. But you see this movement from discretionary to by right happening across the state now in more urban settings, but is also in more suburban and rural ones as well. And then the last category I wanted to talk about is fees. And I think it was Julie who sort of stole the thunder on this one, but the biggest way that fee structures can actually discourage multifamily and more affordable housing types is by charging fees by the number of units. And under this system, the 2 units that you see on the screen are charged the exact same fee, which means that a developer is incentivized in some ways to build as large of a unit as the market will bear to get their money's worth. So it's structuring fees based on something like square footage or another metric like it can encourage denser projects with smaller unit sizes, which tend to actually have less of an impact and can make more efficient use of the infrastructure as well. So that concludes my presentation. I'll just finish by saying that these policy recommendations all came from our housing policy toolkit, which SACOG released a little over a year ago. We're really interested in doing an update to that toolkit at some point. So please do let us know if we're hitting on the right policy and regulatory barriers and solutions. At this point, actually, almost every single SACOG member agency is using state grant funds to implement one or more of these toolkit policies, but certainly always more work to do. With that, I'll just hand it back to Chair Sander. Thank you.
Thank you. Some SACOG board members may have recognized parts of that presentation because it came out of our housing policy toolkit. from 2018, I think. Is that right, Dov?
Yes, very late, I think December 2018.
So private sector, you know, of the examples we just heard about, is there something in there that sounds like it could be a tipping point for a project? I certainly heard a couple of you comment already on things certainly related to this, but does that resonate with you, what we just talked about, what we just heard about?
Yes, 100%. This is Julie. Do all of it. Do all of it a year ago.
That's great. That's great. So there's zoning, development, and fees basically are the 3 points here. Any one of those stand out more than the others, or do you think they're sort of equally weighted?
You know, I would always say fees stand out primarily because the developer is trying to assemble their pro forma on the front end. But the more I go through this process again and again on projects, I really have to say that they all bear weight and fairly equally, because for an example, I'm evaluating a project right now that's 144 studio units that we're trying to build as quickly as possible to get housing on the ground that we can lease for less than $1,000 a month. One of the biggest things I don't know, even though the jurisdiction is cooperating on fees, they've encouraged us to submit a development agreement instead of waiting on their process for fee reduction, is basically the time it's going to take to really get this done, because with equity in on the front end and a preferred return on equity, you know, a year of delay creates another $300,000 or $400,000, $500,000 in cost that, if I can eliminate that, is immediately passed along to the consumer. And also, I do really agree with the point of getting it out, get it to the staff level for approval. We can get things so much done so much more quickly working through staff than having to take it to all these various committees that meet once a month. And, you know, again, it just comes down to the time factor and the cost. It's a lot more efficient.
Very good.
I would just add, I would add to what Julie was saying. I think one of the biggest issues is power, candidly, is do you trust your staff? And so as a council member, you know, I can imagine that you want to be able to see large projects, or maybe it's major projects that come before you, but creating a packet of items that you delegate to a staff that you trust and that you've vetted, that is following, you know, in the footprints of what council may desire or what the community may desire, I think is a key way to be able to move projects forward. There is also state legislation to reduce fees to a per square foot basis, which I think cities and agencies have 2 years to move to that standard, which will really help, you know, development to be able to build smaller units. Because right now, if you back into almost any impact fee, they're predicated on a 2,000 square foot house. And so as a developer, it's very difficult to build a 1,000 square foot house because you're not utilizing the maximum of the fee structure. So that's what happens in housing, especially from public builders, is they're backing everything into a yield and a utilization of the fee. And so they're not incentivized. So when it moves to a per square foot basis, if across the board, across all agencies from sewer, water to cities, to school districts, I think it'll be easier, and you may see a slight movement where you don't see everybody working within the same direct square footages. But I would just echo what Julie said. It's all of it. But one of the biggest things I think you can do is to be able to trust your staff, to be able to make those decisions and give them a defined set of packages and parameters under which they can exercise their authority.
Okay, SACOG board members. Oh, who else do we have?
This is Julie again.
Yes.
I just want to really echo what Deanna just said. I think that trusting staff is imperative. What happens when you trust your staff is then the thing that somebody gets into contentiously may get elevated. But basically, by not trusting staff, it's as if everything is contentious and it has to go through this huge process. And 95% is really everybody's agreeing on it and wants it to happen. So by simply trusting staff and letting them do their job, it raises the bar on the quality of your staff, and it assumes the best about everybody in the room, and only the exception gets elevated as opposed to everything getting elevated.
I would add to that too. I think one of the things policymakers could be doing is defining particular areas within their city where density is welcome. So that way the broader community is aware. We want for our city, each city has a different philosophy and a different tolerance for a density, you know, within their city. City of Sacramento and Placerville may have different desires as a community. But you should be talking kind of loud and often with the wider community to talk about, we want density here and we want density here. So then if these are moved towards staff being able to make the decision, staff doesn't get this blowback from the community because it's been you know, articulated to community as often as possible, but that staff's working within the parameters of their authority because council and the community has decided these are the areas where we want density.
That's very good. Very good. So, SACOG board members, the buck has been passed. We have three opportunities here to think about. Of any of these examples, do you think you could champion them in your city? Are you willing to trust your staff to make the tough call?
Yes.
Yes, Mike says. All right. Any other SACOG board members have an opinion there?
This is Saragossa. Yes, and I think the only thing on the staff level is we have our loud minority voice of people who will think it's some sort of conspiracy. What is it, Agenda 21 or something? But other than that, yes, absolutely on all those things.
Any other SACOG board members with an opinion there? I know in the past in Rancho Cordova, we have certainly zoned for density, but we have not removed the council as the final arbitrator of whether or not a project meets with that zoning and that plan. So, you know, we really haven't eliminated the process. We have just said this is acceptable to us, but it still has to go through the big, lengthy, costly public process with a lot of NIMBY input. And we had one project. I'm sure all of my colleagues have had this experience. Probably most people on the phone have had this experience of it was zoned for multifamily housing. It was in a plan for multifamily housing for over a decade. Everyone who bought a house in that neighborhood should have known this is going to be a multifamily site. The plan is nationally award winning. It appears in planning textbooks all over the country. This is Capitol Village I'm talking about. And when we got to build that final site, we had 100% opposition from local residents. Not a single local stood up and said, this is a good idea to put multifamily on the site where we always planned it. They were all automatically assumed this is going to be, you know, affordable housing. This is going to be a crime center. This is going to ruin my neighborhood. I need to sell as quick as possible. And it's been built. It has some of the highest rents in the Sacramento region. It's an enormously attractive project. I think it probably benefited everyone's property values as opposed to harm them. But those are really, really tough. And my council voted 5-0. I'm proud of that, to approve it. But it was unbelievable opposition. And we could have avoided all of that had we just set up a staff approval process and said, you know, we decided a long time ago this is what was going to happen. If that project comes forward, we should approve it. I think if we did that on big, that was a big project, but I think if we did that on big projects, but maybe even more importantly, small projects, the impact could be enormous on these corridors. So are there other local policy examples we should talk about? We've had the three here: zoning, development, fees. Maybe there's something in it you want to add to one of those topics or an additional topic. Is there something else someone would like to add?
This is Dina again. I'm so sorry. I'm so passionate about this subject. So
that's fine.
Is one of the things I think that could be done is maybe almost like a opportunity zone. You're having a density zone, And maybe where you have businesses or you have housing adjacent, a traditional single family, maybe you're having a buffer, either like a density buffer, either through, which is pretty typical, I would tell you from a developer perspective, but maybe it's that the density is the lowest on the outside and the most intense in the middle, or you have green space that separates you, doing those kind of things. But part of it, honestly, David, is cities have to decide, is this just fake speak? Do you really want to move in this direction? Which I would tell you from the projects that we've built most recently and which we're the most passionate about. We built a project in the city of Folsom that has multifamily on one side of the street and has single family homes directly across the street. And guess where it is? It's centered right across the street from the largest employer in the city of Folsom, from Intel. We could have sold those homes 10 times over. And so some folks really struggled with, and it wasn't a particularly dense project, but it was slightly more dense. And I think it has created a real district, a real it creates a front door for Intel. And we built another project in the city of Rockland with a roundabout between apartments on one side that are gated and single family homes on the other. And they're unified really by green space. So I think doing those kind of things where you're using a mix of density is really attractive. And candidly, in California, people only get housing that is chosen for them, for the most part, unless you're very affluent and you can afford to, to get a custom home builder. And so, people only respond to the market, because that's all they can buy. So whenever we have found, anytime we've done something that's slightly different in design, more intense colors, different mix of materials, different mix of densities, we have been just absolutely overwhelmed with the response. And the reason being, we truly believe people are thirsty for that. People just don't want, not all people, some people do, but people want that diversity of lifestyle. And so, but in the absence of that, they can only get what is provided to them, which is typical single family, not always large lot, but typical front drive, front yard type of construction. And that's just not the way everybody wants to live, whether you're a millennial or whether you're 65 and you want to age in place. We don't find an age that it's particularly tied to. So anyway, I would just add that I actually think out of this COVID experience, my personal feeling is we will be seeing a lot of more people coming from the Bay Area. That could be a flight both for price, lifestyle, and for reduced density from a larger city. And so I think we're going to, as a region, going to have to kind of wrap our hands around all of this and decide who we want to be in each city and in the totality of the region. So
I hope someone just recorded that because I'm going to need to play that quite often.
We are recording the meeting, and Mr. Chair, we have Director Gallardo would like to make some comments.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an experience, and I've got to be cautious because I think this is coming back to us, but not on a approval project, but when we were in challenging financial times, the city approved a borrow zone where we were trying to attract businesses and basically staff level approval. And we've got great staff, not a problem. Let's get some people in some of these vacant spots. Well, one of them that got approved to go in was actually a school, a private school in a commercial strip mall. And small, and it was little, and it was staff level approval, and they got through. Well, now they want to expand and significantly, which would then take up commercial properties. And it won't even come to us. Technically, it will go to the planning commission. But when we're trying to be so creative and out of the box when we did this and simplify, but you definitely need to consider all the down the road things that might happen. And so it's one that we're struggling with now. And now we got ourselves into this. How do you work around it?
Good comment. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
Director Sander, I actually have a question. As you know, many SACOG staff are participating and listening, and we're actually wondering if some of these regulatory processes and changes were in place, could it lower some of the other barriers that the developers have identified. Maybe not 100%, maybe just a little bit, but what else might the impact be that we don't necessarily see or that we should maybe think about at the staff level?
Is that a question about indirect effect? So in other words, if you pursued this, does it help somewhere we wouldn't automatically connect it to?
Yes, direct and indirect. Is there some other tie there that we should be exploring in more depth?
Anybody have a comment?
This is Dina again. I don't know if Julie would want to say anything. Nothing that I can think of right now because I need a specific project to be able to respond to. I just think that there are times and places where it might be worthwhile for staff to have some control. You know, Councilmember Gallardo's example is a perfect one. Maybe and that's one that you pay tuition as you go. What sounded like a great idea at the time, now they're so successful they want to expand. So maybe in the future for those type of things, you know, the developer, in that case a school, has to understand you can't expand in this location. Or they do what Walmart does a lot. Walmart will entitle a typical grocery store or a super center, but in the beginning they only build the traditional grocery store. So they've already got the entitlement to over time to grow to a superstore. And maybe because that school would want to grow to the super expanded size, and maybe it would kick it up to council. I don't know. I would just add that.
This is Julie again. You know, one of the things in the discussion of barriers is you can get yourself into such a loop about the barriers that you can kind of stay stuck there. And in some regards, one of the things I would really encourage the task force to do in the days of coronavirus and even what preceded coronavirus, if we agree that this is an accelerant to a direction we were already trending, is to really think about where you want to go. You know, any problem that you solve has three components to it if you want to solve the problem well. And the first component is really, really understanding where you are and what is your baseline. And in some cases, like we talk about sewer and water, like what's existing. And then you have to have a really clear picture on where you want to go. And the problem solving is the delta in between where we are and where we want to be. And I think as we work through this, the more we understand what commercial corridors really want to be, whether the two examples that Dove put up of the, you know, more urban side versus the little bit more suburban, softer kind of urbanization of commercial corridor, they both have common denominators and similar components. And I would just really encourage the group to take a look at what you want the future to look like. The more you understand where you want to go as a community, and I think Deanna mentioned this previously about show me where you want the density to be, show me your plan, show me where we can succeed with you as a development partner. That we kind of look at this and understand, okay, what is the ideal build out for an acre? Is it 50 homes? Is it 140, you know, apartments? What does it take to sustain a community? What does it take to sustain 6,000 square feet of retail? What does it take to sustain 30,000 square foot of office? How many rooftops does it take? And the more you create this baseline model that takes you to the direction you want to go, the easier it is to problem solve and the less it will cost you to get there. And I did want to add one more thing, and that is design. I think we have just generally this thought that good design within a community is a perpetual reiteration of what already exists, as opposed to really, really challenging ourselves to do some tremendously great design that attracts people who want something new. I think it was an excellent point that was made that people only get to buy what's on the ground for the most part. You know? So let's raise the bar and push ourselves a little bit. You know, when you go to European urban environments, you don't see them trying to repeat something that they built 100 years ago or 200 years ago. They're not pushing for false historicism. You know, they're not trying to create a theme park. They're basically looking for the best design of every era, and they integrate it together, and it makes a really, really interesting and vibrant type of community. And I hope as a collective, we get better at just inviting good design and something maybe we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. I think the often uniform sort of false pretense of everything's the same here, and there's a master design book that takes care of everything, leads us to extremely sterile environments that don't feel real or human sized, and don't lead to that experience that's really necessary, I think, now for retail or even community level success. So I think that's a very good comment. All right. Well, this has been a really productive, I think, and informative discussion. I've got a lot to think about here. I think our SACOG staff, Monica, sounds like we've got a lot to work with.
Yes, thank you. We do.
In
This is
terms of
wonderful.
comments. So I want to thank you all for that. Now, we do have this additional presentation here on REAP funds, and Jennifer, I think, is Jennifer on the line somewhere? Jennifer, there you are.
Hi. Hi.
You're going to tell us about REAP funds and SACOG's role in disseminating those, I think.
Yeah. I'm going to share a short presentation as well. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
We can.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so we are going to transition to talking about a funding opportunity, really, that is available to pay for many of the changes that we were just talking about. The Regional Early Action Planning Program, or REAP, was born out of the 2019 Housing Trailer Bill, more specifically Assembly Bill 101. AB 101 actually does a number of things related to housing and planning, or housing and financing. But one of the things is that it establishes a one-time funding for cities and counties, but also for regions. The local agency program for cities and counties is being called LEAP. That's the Local Early Action Planning Funds. And these funds are available to cities and counties right now through HCD for a wide range of planning activities, as long as there's a strong nexus to that activity to increasing housing production. So many of the things that we just heard about, such as fee changes, zoning code changes, process streamlining, those are all eligible activities under the LEAP program. But as I said, HCD has also established this one-time funding for regional agencies, councils of governments, and MPOs like SACOG. So under REAP, the Regional Early Action Planning Program, SACOG is eligible for just under $6.8 million. We have essentially until the end of the year, January of 2021, to apply for these funds, and they have to be expended by August of 2023. HCD did make up to 25% of the REAP funds available in late 2019. So just last month, the SACOG board approved the components of how we'll spend our first 25% of these REAP funds. And that's outlined here on this slide. But throughout last year, we had our year 2 of Civic Lab, which was focused on commercial corridors, and where those project teams have identified increased housing on the corridor as part of the need to help revitalize the corridor. We wanted to provide some of this early funding out of REAP to those teams, to the projects that they've identified, planning projects, such as many of the ones we've been talking about, like a market feasibility analysis. How do you make housing pencil on the corridor? Assessing what are the zoning code changes to allow housing on the corridor. Those are the types of projects we're seeing some of those Civic Lab teams wanting to spend this funding on. And then we've also allocated about $1 million in total to sub-allocate to jurisdictions to help with their housing elements. Housing elements in this region are due in May of 2021. So they have just about a year to finalize those. And we know that with a larger RHNA allocation this time to our region, but also just changes in state law make that process and those updates quite a bit heftier than they've been in the past. So we wanted to help, at least in some way, help the funding of those housing elements. So it's given out to local jurisdictions based on the allocation of the RHNA to each jurisdiction, with a minimum amount of $10,000 and a maximum amount of $200,000 going to any jurisdiction. And then, of course, we do have some administrative costs for the REAP program in general that we are paying for out of the REAP funds. So we submitted this application for these projects and for funding to HCD a couple of weeks ago. We hope to get our award letter in early May, and then we'll be able to start getting this early REAP funds out. But in the meantime, we've also been thinking about how to spend the remaining $5 million out after we spend that early 25%. We have roughly $5 million left. And SACOG's guiding principle as we're thinking about the REAP funds and how these should be spent is that they should support the 2020 MTP SCS that we just adopted last November. More specifically, REAP funds should be used to plan and accelerate for more infill housing, more product choices, and to better leverage funding opportunities, future funding opportunities such as Green Means Go. A lot of this very much mirrors what we've been talking about today. You guys all, I think, pointed out the need for housing on the corridors from an economic standpoint, revitalization, and inclusive standpoint. And I don't want to divert too much, but from an MTP standpoint, we also know from our modeling work that it's that type of land use introducing more infill housing and more housing to these corridors that is a significant factor in helping whether or not we achieve our plans, greenhouse gas reduction goals, as well as our vehicle miles traveled reduction goals. Land use is a big component of that. Specifically in our MTP, roughly 64% of the new housing that we're planning for in our region is planned for in these infill areas highlighted on this map. This highlights pretty much all of the commercial corridors you guys have been talking about as well. And specifically in these infill areas, the homes we're talking about are a little bit different than the homes we have today. It's accessory units, it's homes on smaller lot sizes, it's attached housing, anything from the fourplexes and the sixplexes that we saw in Dobbs' presentation, to condos and apartments, really facilitating that different type of housing stock, as well as the location of the housing. So we wanted to keep these goals in mind as we're thinking about how we spend the REAP funds. HCD is very flexible in the types of activities. It does have to be for housing planning, and there does have to be a strong nexus to housing production, but the list of activities is very broad, and on the screen I've just listed the main ones that are called out, although I think there is some flexibility to be creative with these REAP funds as well. But already we know they can be used for many of the things that the LEAP funds can be used for, which is specific plans, CEQA clearance, infrastructure studies to help really understand that water and sewer need better along a corridor, revamping your planning or approval process that, including the by right process that Dob was just talking about, and any components within these, right? If it doesn't fund the full thing, it can at least fund a component of it. It can fund establishing a local housing trust fund, but it can't capitalize it. It can do form-based codes and any other technical assistance really that can be used and have it that tie back to increase housing production. So the range of these REAP funds really is quite broad. And then I'll finish quickly just with our timeline and we can have a discussion. So as I mentioned, in April, we applied for that first 25%, and we continue to work on what is a framework for this remaining $5 million that we'll have. In May, we're hoping to get our award for the first 25%, and we're also hoping to share a draft outline for this remaining 5%, the remaining $5 million with our Land Use and Natural Resources Committee to get their input, and also with our local agency partners. Then that would set us up in June. Hopefully on the early 25%, we've started to put those MOUs and subrecipient agreements in place to really start getting that money out, but also teeing up potentially a board action outlining the use of the remaining $5 million. From there, the calendar gets a little bit more fuzzy, so it gets a little smaller on your screen, sort of purposely. By late summer, early fall, potentially then we're set up to apply for the remaining LEAP funds, and then by the winter really set out and do the program for whatever gets outlined in the next few months to spend those funds. And for that, I think, I would kick it back to Chair Sander to have a discussion on anything you want, but I think staff in particular would be interested in if this task force has any additional opinions on what we've already heard. I think a lot of what we've already talked about helps inform this list of what are some of the potential things SACOG should look at for using these funds, but we'd be happy to hear any other thoughts that the task force has on how we might best use these funds.
Okay, task force colleagues, any comments on that list? Anything there you thought particularly ripe or anything missing? I mean, I certainly think in the context of our previous discussion about the need to update plans to accommodate, for example, an abbreviated staff approval process for certain projects, this would be funding that would allow you to get to that point or help you get to that point.
Hi, this is
Yes.
Louise from SGC. I guess one comment, and I don't know that it really fits in necessarily within the scope of REAP, but I just wanted to flag as these conversations move forward, I think a potential implication of COVID-19 is going to be the impact on our transit systems. And of course, ridership is down significantly. Gas sales tax is down significantly. And so as we think about robust commercial corridors, and we're thinking about the kinds of development where, there's reduced parking requirements, that is predicated on thinking about that in an integrated way with a robust transit network that could be public transportation, active transportation options, et cetera. And so I think thinking through that connection, especially post COVID-19, is going to be incredibly important as we think about how do we keep those systems viable and working, especially as people are easing their way back into at whatever timeline that is, back into being out into the world. And so I think that is a dynamic. And I know Jose mentioned this earlier, a little bit of what's happening in China and Korea, but I think needs to be really reevaluated and thoughtfully approached in this work in the light of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think those are really good comments because transit obviously was in a state of enormous flux before COVID and has been for a decade. What we envision as transit, I don't know if many people are going to be able to venture to accurately predict where we are 10 years from now with regard to, more electric vehicles and more ride share and more technology and more automated vehicles, perhaps. The diversity of what's possible out there is pretty remarkable. So COVID has certainly had an enormous impact there as well in terms of planning. And all of these, or most of these old commercial corridors, are also transit centers, which is why you want to densify the housing. But what does that mean in a new transit world? Yeah, very, very good questions.
David, this is
Yes.
Julie. I do really want to reiterate that the power of the commercial corridor is not just its connection to other areas, which is really where transit of like a density, like light rail or something of that nature comes into play. but all the more important why it's really good to understand how that community in a self-referential way supports itself. In the event people are simply walking and biking and wanting to make use of their really localized goods and services and workforce, the more we become pedestrian oriented and bicycle friendly and everything that we kind of already aspire to, the more those commercial corridors can succeed, whether or not they are a transportation hub that's getting you, say, to downtown Sacramento. It's important that they thrive as an artery, but it's also important that they thrive with kind of their own heartbeat. And that's why I keep encouraging the team to really, really understand what makes that corridor, what are the common denominators from a housing, retail, office perspective that let it stand on its own and be successful, even if everything shut down and you were just like self-reliant. What's the tipping point of rooftops around a light rail station that lets that community to continue to thrive regardless of a pandemic?
So really it's, I'll put it in biology terms because that's what I am. This is an ecosystem, right? This commercial corridor is an ecosystem, and you need to have a population in the ecosystem that can sustain the ecosystem under a variety of external stimuli and pressures.
This is Dina. I just wanted to add to this as well. I'm working on a project in downtown San Diego in the Gaslamp District. And the Gaslamp District is primarily an entertainment area of San Diego. And one of the things that the city is really realizing is how different the Gaslamp may feel if it had more housing, because the housing and the relationship between the restaurateurs, the active space, the green space is totally different if you have residential living there. Maybe not in the most urban locations of where the tourist area is, maybe one block out, is because again, just like somebody else was saying earlier, that the restaurants are off 75% in their city. Maybe if you had housing directly within that zone and that ecosystem, maybe it would only be 30% off, just because your relationship to those uses are direct because they are in your ecosystem. So I think we all have those experiences and I happen to live in Rockland, but I can think of all sorts of situations in Rockland and downtown Roseville, and I can think of places in Yuba City and Placerville where there are the prime corridors where the retail and the restaurants actually occur, and how they may feel today if they actually had housing. I think they would feel slightly more vibrant and maybe a little bit more intimate, because your relationship, you're coming right out your door and you're buying from those purveyors directly. So.
Yeah, very good.
This is Julie again. I just want to add to what Deanna said. We don't even really have to go to San Diego to see this play out in Sacramento. The arena shut down, and you can see the devastating impact to all of the restaurants that really were banking on the arena as the primary driver of their customer traffic. I would suggest that probably most of those locations are shut down right now with no traffic, where when you creep into Midtown, you have restaurant operators that continue to get out and pick up and drop off because of rooftop. I think this is exactly kind of the point we're making.
Yeah. Is it a healthy ecosystem that can survive on its own, or does it have to rely on an external stimuli to exist? Very good. Okay. Any other comments before I close out? I want to be sure we have a few moments here for our Executive Director, James Corliss, to say something. Lynette or Monica, I want to be sure we don't have public comment anywhere, do we? Any public comment that we need to address? If not, I think, James, why don't we give you a few minutes? I'd love to hear your comments on what you heard today.
Thanks, Chair Sander. First and foremost, I just thought this was right now in the last month, you approach a meeting or a conversation like this, you're always wondering how it's going to be relevant given what's happened. And I just want to say, I think this is an incredibly relevant conversation, and I was fascinated by it and the give and take and the back and forth. In some ways, kind of how the long-term health of these commercial corridors are going to be more important than ever. So I really appreciate that. The other, so two things really maybe back to the SACOG board members. One is just want to put the finer point on Jen's presentation that when we went through Civic Lab year 2 and we had all these great teams get together, the one thing that we, in all honesty, didn't really have was the resources at the end of that Civic Lab process, as much as we had them, say, for the transportation cohort the year earlier. So these REAP funds are a real opportunity. Oh, sorry. The new reality.
Yes.
The number one, those REAP funds are a real opportunity, and you've seen we've applied for some early action funds, and those are largely being kind of discussed by the Land Use Committee, our Land Use and Natural Resources Committee. So number one, real opportunity, and really excited to be able to give you all a little bit more time to think about this and think about the potential for some of those REAP funds and even the LEAP funds, the local level, connected to this topic of commercial corridors. Number one, and then I think, Dina, I think it was Dina who said, what if we, every jurisdiction is different, right? And even within all your jurisdictions, you have these different pockets and corridors and neighborhoods and new versus old. But what if we actually allowed all of our local communities to really define these kinds of areas for density and for revitalization on your own terms? That's exactly what the Green Zones and the Green Means Go program is all about. We've been talking about Green Means Go from getting some of the state grant money to allow revitalization and some of this stuff to happen. The Green Zone idea is really to be able to kind of bottom up define where we want some of these infill opportunities. And that is, again, it's been in front of the Land Use and Natural Resources Committee. That will play out over the remainder of the calendar year to give your staff a little bit more time to work with you and your communities to really define these kind of these infill areas on your own terms, because it's going to be different in every community. So I just want to make those two connections to the work that is going to be before, and the policy decisions are going to be before all of you. Well, thanks.
Okay, very good. Well, I want to thank everybody on the task force for your participation today. I think this has been a really good meeting. Staff is going to give us a meeting summary in a couple of weeks, and you can all look to that. And I think it's also are we going to make a presentation or just report on our meeting status to the Land Use and Natural Resources Committee?
We will have a summary and a staff report as well.
Okay.
So we'll have time to discuss there.
Very good. I think our next meeting are tentatively set for September 1st and November the 16th. Is that correct?
Correct. And Lynette has put those on a calendar. We still list them as tentative just because of the current COVID scenario and the remote work. But yes, those are our tentative dates.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you all for your participation. I'm really pleased with the level of discussion we're having here. I'm looking forward to some good outcomes for the region for our effort. So thank you again. Stay safe. Stay at home if you can. Try not to touch those eyes and noses, mouths. Maintain that social distance, and we will see you soon, somewhere, virtually. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.